Hello and welcome to AviaDev Insight Africa, the podcast offering a window to the world of African aviation with your host, John Howell, CEO and founder of AviaDev Africa. Today, I am delighted to be welcoming back somebody who has been at the forefront of collating the experiences of many companies engaged in the process of making aviation more sustainable. We last spoke in November 2023. The person in question is Dirk Singer. He is from SimpliFlying, who are thought leaders in this space that have an amazing Sustainability in the Air podcast, also a wonderful book, which I'm holding here, the first edition. And we are here today because there is a second edition coming up. So this is not an updated version. This is the follow-up to the first edition. And I know many of you out there have read that because what I loved about it was how case study focused it was and how industry focused it was. So we're now in April 2025. The second edition comes out already, so I will put the link in the show notes. And we're here to preview the new book. I think I may as well say welcome to the podcaster.
Thank you for having me on again, John.
And for this, it's great. Yeah, love talking to you because you do so much research into this space, and I think that the only place to start, and I would encourage our listeners, if you haven't, you can go back to November 2023 to the episode that we did. But we want to talk about that interim period and how we've moved on. When we first spoke, of course, the industry was in recovery mode. It was starting to show those very strong signs, but it wasn't fully recovered post-COVID. There were already as well, the other thing that's very interesting is there were loads of new technologies that you talked about in that first book. So what I want to do to start with is understand the size of the environmental imperative. Is it as strong as ever? And also, like, how pressing is the need to find new alternatives and how pressing is the environmental impetus here to make a change?
So let's look at what's going on at the moment. There was an article by the Wall Street Journal the other day. It's one of a series of articles that I've seen about Airbus and its hydrogen efforts. And if you remember 2 years ago, Airbus was very gung-ho on producing hydrogen aircraft, and they've significantly scaled back their ambitions. And it looks to be something for the 2040s and 2050s, and not for the 2030s that was originally said. And why is the reason is that no CEO is going to voluntarily disrupt a legacy technology which is wildly profitable, and for which they have a decade's worth of forward orders, including for many African airlines that you cover, in exchange for a new technology, which is where you literally have to reinvent everything from the configuration of the aircraft to working out how you store and transport this new fuel. What we're seeing is the industry doubling down on existing technology and existing aircraft. And one of the issues with that is the ICCT, that's the International Council for Clean Transportation, came out with a study last year that said that to meet our 2050 targets, every aircraft has to have net zero baked in some shape or form from the mid-2030s onwards. Risk running out of our carbon budget, so to speak, fairly soon. And obviously that presents a number of challenges. As I said, Airbus has a decade's worth of forward orders. Boeing does as well, but of course Boeing has now extra challenges due to the tariffs that are coming in. And of course these aircraft are going to be flying for the next 20, 30 years. So if you're an airline in Africa, for example, and you order an A330 or an A350 or an A321 today, you will get that aircraft at some point in the 2030s. And that aircraft will be flying for you and probably for someone else. It could quite possibly be 2060. So beyond the net zero date. And I think that changed the shape of the problem that we faced and also made it a lot more pressing. Obviously, it means that as before, sustainable aviation fuel has to be the main driver of net zero and decarbonization, which presents all sorts of challenges. And we also have to look at other solutions like electric air capture and carbon removal, and see how and where hydrogen and electric aircraft can fit into the mix.
Yeah, for sure. I think you've touched on so many points that I was going to bring up in terms of you've got aircraft being extended beyond their normal life because of the lack of supply. And, that there's things like this and obviously demand coming. And like you say, nobody wants to write off a perfectly serviceable asset when it's making the money at this stage. So there has to be the carrot and the stick approach, which I think is what you always cover. And I think that has changed. We talked about this a lot, about sustainability being something that we should all aim for, but actually it's changed a little bit, right? In terms of, okay, we can, but actually the economic imperative trumps it all at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting point. So I think the other thing I wanted to touch on straight away is we've seen some consolidation and some failures and some different things over that 2-year period.
Right.
With any new industry, with any new drive to technology and trying to find a solution to something, there's going to be consolidation, there's going to be terminations, there's going to be failures. That is how you know you're being successful, that things are failing and failing fast and consolidating. So talk us through what's happened in the last couple of years when it comes to what is now in the driving seat and what's driving the most investment, most interest as a solution in this space. Because you talked about everything in that first book, the electric, the hydrogen, all sorts of different elements.
Yeah, so first of all, let's talk about one of the companies that's in book one that didn't quite make it. That's Universal Hydrogen. And we didn't have a full chapter to them, but we refer to them as part of the chapter for JetBlue Ventures, with JetBlue Ventures having been an investor in Universal Hydrogen, was one of the highest profile sustainable aviation cash flows of the last year. They raised over $100 million. Their mission, like Zero Avia, which is still around, was to retrofit regional aircraft with hydrogen electric powertrains. They had quite a neat way of doing this. They called it an espresso model, so just like an espresso machine to make your coffee. They talked about that they bring in these hydrogen capsules you could slot into your 80 or 72 or whatever it is, and have it flying on hydrogen electric power instead of the fossil fuel kerosene powered powertrain. And it was very promising. But ultimately, they went under the summer of last year. And that's really for a few reasons. Obviously, the money ran out. This is a very capital intensive business, and you need a very long cash runway, especially with something like producing new aircraft, or in their case, new aircraft engines. And there was a lot of uncertainty at the time about whether some of these subsidies in the United States around the Inflation Reduction Act would remain in place. And of course, now with the election of Trump, that is a very pressing issue, and they failed to find the money to put them forward. And I think that the lesson we learned from Universal Hydrogen is that infrastructure matters, and this comes back to what we talked about with Airbus. It's not only that you have to produce the aircraft and you have to reconfigure the aircraft, but you have to have a whole support infrastructure to go along with it. I read one study which said that if an airport to reconfigure itself to power hydrogen aircraft, it would have to build a storage facility which would be the size of a new terminal. Now, that's obviously not really a realistic ask for an airport like that, which is A, space constrained, and B, has a lot of other infrastructure plans in place, and Heathrow's been the case, the third runway. Infrastructure is a very important issue that we have to overcome. And that's why in the second book, we also have case studies and stories. It's 10 new case studies and stories that we're putting forward. And we focus very much on commercial viability and solutions that can work. And I'll give you one very concrete example. We feature a hybrid electric aircraft company called Electra. And Electra, they're based in the United States, and they produce an eVTOL. So you can land in very short spaces with hydrogen electric engines. And Electra say that they can land on the sides of a soccer or a football pitch. So something like the Manhattan or Wall Street heliport, they could potentially land up. But unlike eVTOLs, which have obviously made a lot of noise, they can carry double the passengers, they can fly double the range, cheaper to operate in operating costs, and with hybrid electric, they can recharge the electric battery in flight using the main motor. So it doesn't require any existing infrastructure. And the other day, they raised $150 million. And this proves that even in the US, even in the era of Trump, with a lot of skepticism towards climate technologies, if you can make a compelling business case, you will succeed. And I think that what Electra also, it's very interesting what they're trying to do is the management team there. They say that for electric aircraft in the first instance, there's no point competing with fossil fuel equivalent aircraft. You have to be where existing aircraft are not. So they have this idea of direct aviation, where, bearing in mind they can land in very small spaces, they can bring aviation much closer to the consumer and land outside of the conventional airport environment, which again, thinking about it from an African context, might be quite interesting to some of your listeners. And those are the solutions that are being put forward and that are succeeding 18 months on from when we published the first book.
Yeah, look, I think when we first talked to Uber Elevate, as they were, and then of course
Right.
Eve now with Embraer, they presented at AviaDev back in 2018, I think. And the whole use case there was, look, we could fly over the top of Lagos, because to get from Victoria Island to the airport can take you half an hour or 4 hours. And the idea being we could go over the top of that. Now, that's the same thing you're talking about with Electra. The challenge there is it's civil aviation authority regulations, and those people being willing to say, hey, yeah, sure, you guys have a go. Like, where are we going to test this first? So there's challenges there as well. And I think the point you made about Heathrow and what would have to happen in terms of the infrastructural side of things, the big thing there is, yes, great, Heathrow, and that's probably unfeasible, but you would need that at every single airport. You can't just have one airport with a hydrogen. You need to be able to refuel wherever you go, which is what we have at the moment. So it's so much wider than, hey, we can power this off this thing. We need the supply and all that supply chain to come through too.
Absolutely. If you were to run a hydrogen flight from, I don't know, from Heathrow to, let's say, an African destination to Casablanca, you wouldn't only need the hydrogen facilities at the start and at the end, but you would also need potentially Lisbon or Madrid, or in case there's an emergency and this aircraft has to land. So there's a whole sort of piece behind it that has to be solved. And that is one of the reasons why hydrogen aviation hasn't taken off in the way that it should. Now, having said that, we're looking to also to retrofit aircraft with hydrogen electric engines. They were in the first book, and they are still going. And I think that for companies like that, there is still scope, because there's talk of things such as called hydrogen clusters, which you could set up in, I think that New Zealand is looking at it, Hydrogen Islands of Scotland is looking at it. I guess there's a number of African countries could maybe look at it, where you have a regional network of airports where you could set up hydrogen stations at each one. And that is obviously more feasible and more possible in a regional setting, rather than, as I said, from London to Casablanca, expecting Heathrow, Paris, Madrid, Lisbon, and Casablanca all to be hydrogen ready.
Yeah, it's such a step change, because actually it's the fuel that's changing. And this brings us on really well into the whole conversation around what we can do in the interim from a SAF perspective, because you need something that's ubiquitous, right? You need something that's drop in that will work at the moment, that will work whether it's fossil fuels, whether it's a SAF alternative, but it works the same way, it's the same grade, and it meets the standards. And I spoke with Kwame Bekoe last week, who's obviously launched AfriSAF, which I know you guys have covered as well. Yes. Now, what he's focused on, of course, is using existing agricultural waste and biomass, and then converting that into a sustainable aviation fuel, which I think, and I did ask him about this, it's particularly interesting that he spent the last 2.5 years working with Zero, which was creating e-fuels. Again, if you can scale that up, it's the same thing. It's a drop-in fuel. It's the same. And maybe this is the challenge with hydrogen, is that's a completely new fuel. Then you've got fuels are still a fair way away, but actually what we can do right now is SAF production from biomass. Would you agree that's the lowest hanging fruit at the moment? And is that where we're seeing some success in production?
Yeah, obviously, as I'm sure most of your listeners will know, you're broadly, when you talk about sustainable aviation fuel, it is a drop-in fuel, so it works with today's aircraft, today's technology, but there's 3 generations. And right now, most SAF is what's called heifer-based SAF, which is essentially used cooking oils. That flight that last year, actually at the end of 2023, that went from London across the Atlantic and Virgin Atlantic, that was 100% SAF power, that was done by heifer-based SAF. Now, the problem with heifer-based SAF is that its most sustainable aviation fuel production today is made from it, but it's used cooking oil that is very often imported from countries like China and Malaysia, which, number one, there's questions about the provenance of it. Number two, they're going to need it for their own domestic supply very soon, especially if a country like China produces its own SAF mandates. And number three, there simply isn't enough of it. And so we have to look at second and third generation SAF. And what Kwame is looking at is actually both those things. So second generation SAF, taking agricultural waste or agricultural byproducts and using something called the alcohol to jet method to produce sustainable aviation fuel. And then he used to be at Zero, which was an e-fuels company, and that's third generation. So particle fuels or e-fuels, where you take carbon dioxide and clean hydrogen and renewable electricity, and you make fuel that way. And that second and third generation is certainly the way forward. I mean, personally, I think that what Kwame is doing is very interesting because, the African continent at the moment has no SAF facilities. I think Kwame said that there's one in South Africa, and that's it, for the whole of the continent. And there is obviously a need. Yet at the same time, it is a feedstock abundant continent, both in terms of agricultural waste, which as Kwame explained to you, is very often just being burned at the moment rather than being used and can be bought cheaply. And of course, for the third generation of sustainable aviation e-fuels, you have abundant and cheap potential for renewable energy. So certainly, I think that what he's doing is very interesting, and there's a lot of potential for Africa to become a real center in cost-effective and plentiful sustainable aviation fuel development and production.
Yeah, the thing that was so interesting and different for me was the fact that you always get the same thing thrown at it is, oh, if you're going to grow this crop to then chop it down to turn it into SAF, that is arable land that we could use to feed people, and it's taking that away. Now, his solution is stuff that is already wasted, that is being burned right now. So as you say, he can make he can provide an income to those farmers and take a hassle off their hands, because he's going to take this waste away and use it himself and pay them for it. It's a win-win in terms of that. And I see the numbers he talked about in terms of that waste are just gigantic anyway. And it does bring us to the African conversation, which I'll come back to shortly. But I wanted to come back to something that I know is very close to your heart, and you've already alluded to it as well, which is we're in April 2025, or at the end of April, and I want to understand how the investment is being shaped by what's happening in a geopolitical standpoint, because of course we've had leaders like Donald Trump come into the White House and say, drill, baby, drill, and basically throw out anything that's environmental in its focus. And so is that filtering through not just to other countries? I'm interested to know that, but in terms of investment, and you touched on it already about there was some support with the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course will be withdrawn. So does it make it attractive? Are you seeing that already, or do we not need to worry because the imperative is strong and people still believe in this?
Yeah, so if you look at it at a US context, I mean, obviously I already mentioned Electra, which has successfully raised money for its hybrid electric aircraft concept, despite everything that's going on. And of course, even though federal subsidies and support were important, there's also very, very significant state subsidies in places like California and Oregon and Washington and Illinois, and they will continue, driving adoption. And then some clean technologies are still thriving under the Trump administration. So geothermal is getting a lot of support, which is a new form of clean energy. Again, in an African context, and in countries like Rwanda and Kenya and Uganda are very interested in geothermal power. And you can also use the same infrastructure and the same skill set that the oil industry does, because essentially you're drilling deep into the ground. So there's that's getting support. And also carbon capture with direct air capture facilities is getting support as well. And of course, the main beneficiary of the Inflation Reduction Act was red states in the US. So Republican districts, so states such as, Oklahoma and Louisiana and Texas have benefited disproportionately from the subsidies. And the congressmen and women who represent those districts are obviously not that willing to see those jobs disappear. So despite all the noise that you see coming out of the Trump administration, the picture on the ground is perhaps a little bit more nuanced than this. But at the same time, I did read a report the other day that a lot of climate tech funding is coming back to Europe, where there are strong sort of government regulations in place. I mean, obviously, from January this year, both in the UK and the European Union, we had the introduction of the SAF mandate, which sets progressively higher targets, 2% this year. Then in 2030 in the EU, it's 6%, going up to 70% by 2050. And of course, those targets will have to be met. And then combined with that, you also have carbon pricing. And I read a report by Dr. Dana Chacun the other day, who's an expert in this area. And she said that actually, if you're an airline that's operating in Europe, the most expensive thing you can do is to do nothing. Because from the 2030s, carbon pricing is going to hit you hard, combined with penalties if you don't meet the SAF mandate. So certainly that push and pull factor in Europe is there.
Yeah, it is a big challenge, of course, for the airlines to know what 2030 is going to look like, and will there be a change of policy? It's something that seems to have stuck in a European context for quite some time, but of course there's big changes in other parts of the world, and it's how do you plan for all of this, especially if you're operating older aircraft and you don't have the SAF facilities locally. You end up doing this thing, book and claim, where you pay for it, but it's used somewhere else. So,
and I remember when we spoke to Kenya Airways a year ago for the SkyTeam Flight Challenge, of course, where SkyTeam Airlines, they run this competition every year for sustainable flights. I think that they said they had to fill their aircraft in Amsterdam with SAF, because obviously in Kenya at the time there was none available, which, coming back to the conversation that we said, is a crazy situation, because Kenya is a country that has potentially lots of abundant feedstock where they could produce this thing a lot more cheaply than other areas of the world.
Yeah, we'll come to that in a minute, because I want to talk about the opportunities and threats for Africa. But before we do that, I wanted to ask the question about the OEMs and their engagement in this, because what I saw very early on was that their rush and their race was, we're going to prove that our airframe, our engine, whatever it may be, is SAF compatible. And I think most of them have done that, or they're on the way to doing that.
Yes.
But I haven't seen too many do much more than that. And I suppose that's where I'm thinking, do you want to just say, look, that's our role in this, we are now compatible with it? Or are we now seeing that there is some investment in early stage tech to try and increase SAF production so that it can be used on their aircraft and in their engines? And I'm not singling out any particular one, and maybe I've got the wrong end of the stick in the way I see it, but are you seeing that they're engaging earlier on, or are they literally saying, look, we're here, we're ready to operate when the SAF is ready, or when the fuel is ready to be used?
So actually one of the chapters in the second volume of the book is about Boeing, and Boeing's sustainable aviation fuel strategy is called SAF with an emphasis both on the SAF and an emphasis on the and. And I like it because it's honest and it's realistic. Boeing is recognizing that sustainable aviation fuel is the viable short to medium term solution, but they also have irons in a few other fires. Like, for example, they're invested in Whisk, which is producing autonomous eVTOLs. And of course, autonomous flight is a very interesting area, and I guess a whole different sort of conversation, that I'm sure you could have on this. And Boeing is trying to do what it can to help push for a greater supply of SAF. So they inked deals with a number of SAF suppliers. The Farnborough Air Show last year, and there was quite a high-profile announcement they made where they were going to support a UK company called SimpliFlying Green Fuels. And SimpliFlying Green Fuels essentially turns sewage, sustainable aviation fuel, so it uses sewage as a feedstock. So they have that, and they have quite a sort of an aggressive push towards making their aircraft SAF ready and promoting the use of fuel. But ultimately, once Boeing sells that aircraft to an airline, it is up to the aircraft owner and operator to decide what's done. Certainly with the major manufacturers, they're doing a certain amount, but I would say they can only do.
Okay. No, that's great. And we talk to them regularly about what it is you're doing, etc. I just feel like stage one is definitely making sure that everything's compatible. And I'm sure they'd have a lot to say about how they're focusing on the future, and also all the things they're doing anyway to make the aircraft more fuel efficient, make the engines more fuel efficient, and all those sorts of things too. There's so much work being done in the aviation industry, and often that's why books like yours are so great, because they do shine a light that we're trying. We're vilified by many people from outside because we're visible. It doesn't mean that we're not admitting there's some sort of problem here, but through the initiatives and the people that you bring through, both through this book, but also, as I've said, get signed up for the newsletter that comes out every week, listen to the podcast, access the information that Dirk and Shashank and the whole team produce, because it's a really valuable resource. So before I let you go, I think I just wanted my final question to be, what does this mean for Africa in terms of opportunities and threats? How do you see its role in the sustainable aviation revolution? Because of course it's being impacted disproportionately by climate change, and how is it going to turn this into an opportunity?
I think that there's two huge opportunities, one around SAF and one around next generation propulsion systems. So let's talk about SAF in the first instance. I know you covered a lot of this when you spoke to Kwame. The biggest problem is there's two problems with SAF. There's the problem of supply, there's not enough of it, and there's the problem of cost. The fact that it costs more than jet air, which can be anywhere from 2 to 10 times the cost of sort of jet fuel at the moment. To bring down sort of the cost, you need to be able to to produce feedstocks cheaply, which is one of the areas that Africa can come in, both in using the agricultural waste products that Kwame is doing, and also in producing cheap green hydrogen via renewable energy. And renewable energy in many African countries is significantly lower than it is elsewhere in the world. So that's opportunity number one. The thing that Africa can solve both the supply and the price challenge around alternative fuels. The second point is around next generation propulsion systems. And something that I've heard a number of electric aircraft company CEOs say is, if you take Anders Forsland of Hart Aerospace, and Hart is actually the only company which is both in Volume 1 and Volume 2, they are producing a hybrid electric 30-seater aircraft. And Anders Indonesia, for example, that there's a potential for them to leapfrog to the next generation technology in the same way that if you look at phones, that a lot of African countries skipped landlines altogether and went straight to mobile phones. And in fact, mobile payment services like M-Pesa were present in African countries first before they were present in Europe. And there's the same potential for African countries to do the same. Because if you introduce a network of electric aircraft, well, you don't have to build roads. You don't have to, sort of create new infrastructure in terms of, let's say, sort of down land or cutting down forests to produce roads or railways. You can have potentially a shuttle of sort of cheap to operate electric aircraft where you have charging stations at regional airports that are a more effective way of getting people from A to B, which can help both local economies and local people get about, and of course help tourism as well. So I think those are the two big opportunities that I see in an African context.
Yeah, brilliant. And we didn't talk massively about the electric side, but again, what a brilliant, again, a great fuel because it's ubiquitous. Like we already use it all the time. It's available everywhere. And you've got the opportunity for solar and wind and all the rest of it to actually create that renewable production cycle as well. It does seem that the electric and obviously the different types of SAF that you've explained today, these are the lowest hanging fruit and they are both offering huge opportunities for Africa. So I'm sure we'll keep watching this as we go. Yeah, massive thanks to you for joining me again, Dirk. Thank you for being here and good luck with the book.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening. I will put the link in the show notes so you can go directly. We'll put the link in, I think, to Amazon where you can buy it there. But there may be some other links we can put in as well for those who can't access that particular shop to access the book. Obviously, there'll be a link in there to the SimpliFlying website as well. And so you can follow Dirk because he always has some interesting takes on the industry through LinkedIn and some of the other platforms as well. If you did enjoy the episode, if there's anybody you think would benefit from listening, please do share it now. Do subscribe so you don't miss another episode. And we will be back with you very soon. Take care. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.